Hello, welcome to episode 9 of the Dutch Steamboat lantern build out. During this episode we're going to go over glass cutting and polishing and varnishing or painting depending on what application we put on these. Glass cutting is something that is relatively easy if you know what you're doing, but it can be very frustrating if you don't follow the proper techniques. What I'm going to do now is cut the glass for the back of the 15-inch Dutch Steamboat lantern. This is regular glass that I would buy at the big box store. Usually what I do is I buy, a fairly large mirror. This here is probably a little bit more than single strength, because buying it that way is the cheapest. If you go to your local glazer, their prices are significantly higher, and if you buy a big enough piece, then you just cut it as required. So I'll measure the inside dimension required, and it looks like it needs to be right around slightly less than 14 inches. Width of the glass cutter, this is a Fletcher glass cutter, which is pretty much all I use. They're not very expensive. They're a couple of $3 or so. I've tried ones with diamond points and everything. They just don't seem to cut the glass as good as these do. This is pretty much all of what a typical glazer would use. Okay, so I put it in, lubricate my wheel, and now the way I hold the glass cutter is like this. This is a recommended way that Fletcher tells you to hold a glass cutter. You don't, and it's probably not good to hold it like a pencil because you want to have vertical pressure on the wheel. So I'll hold it in place, and you'll hear a little sizzling sound. Kind of sounds like when you ran your fingers over the chalkboard when you were a kid. If you don't hear that, you're not scoring the glass. I put the bottom of the glass cutter there, and boom, there we go. So now the next dimension I have to cut is 4¼ inches, and I need a little bigger square to do that. I could use a straight edge too, but a square kind of gets you pretty close to square before you start. Lubricate my wheel again. Place the glass cutter down, hold this in place, and start right at the end and slowly bring it towards me and hear that sizzling sound. Now they don't recommend going over the cut twice because then you'll get a difficult break. Put the bottom of the glass cutter in place, press down, and the line will run right down your score. If you look at this line, it's actually pretty much right on. Let me check and make sure that the dimensions turned out okay. It's 4¼ right on the money. So here's my 2 pieces of glass. They're probably within a 32nd of an inch. So then I'll just dry fit them. In other words, see if they fit. Okay. And put it in place. Pull it down, and there you get an idea of the reflective value of the glass. Also, there's a hole here. This is where I bring in my electrical cords so you can't see them. Now this is handmade glass. It comes from hand blown with a lot of imperfections. And a sheet like this costs about $50 or more. It cost $50 when I bought it, which was a long time ago. Now, one of the things that's very interesting about this glass is if you look at it, it goes from here, it's approximately probably 3/16 of an inch all the way to maybe a little bit stronger than a 1/16. and the same is here. And if you look down, it is a little wavy gravy, so it's not straight like a regular piece of glass. And the edges are always turned up. So with this glass, you have to be really, really careful. So now one of the issues is that this glass, to fit in the lantern properly, the tolerances are so tight because of one, trying to get it in, and two, fitting it and making sure that you have proper spacing in the top and the bottom. You got maybe a 1/16 of an inch of error. And I found sometimes with really expensive glass, it's best to cut a pattern out of glass just to make sure that it works and fits because of the tight tolerances. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is when you do your measurements, obviously it has to fit in this dimension and this dimension. Okay, what you fix in this dimension, it's a little bit tight in this one by about a 1/16. I'll take care of that when I cut it. So the first piece I'm going to cut would be this 15-inch piece. Here we go. It's the same cutting process. You'll hear the sizzle as I draw this towards me. I'm putting probably about 10 pounds of pressure and click it right off at the end. I'll take and put this right there. Boom. It ran pretty good. We are now entering the polishing phase of the lanterns. This is the last thing that I do prior to varnishing or painting. Now, I always wear cotton gloves when I polish because you don't want to get fingerprints on an area that you polish. It's inevitable that you will, but the way I get around that, or never get around it, is I rough polish the lanterns, as you can see right here. This lantern has been rough polished both on the inside as well as the hard to get places, as well as the grids to include the top handle and so forth. So this process is, fairly time consuming. I think I got close to 4 hours in just polishing this, because there's some really hard to get to places. Now you may say, well, why don't you use a high-speed polisher? And I have one of those, but the fact is there's a lot of force on those, and if it catches the metal the wrong way, as hard as you're holding it, it can twist it out of your hands, and then you have a real big problem. Plus, it also results in a different variation of polishing. So I find it simpler to, at this stage, just to use a regular polish. Now, if I have a really bad spot, I use steel wool to clean it up, and I use the 4/0 steel wool, which is really the finest grade. The polish that I've used for the last 50 years is Simichrome, and I don't think they've changed the formula a bit. And when I get into the final polishing stage, I generally use a cotton cloth, and the polish is pretty simple. You just put it on, you go over the areas that need to be polished, because when you heat things with the torch or the soldering iron, it sometimes changes the color configuration. And when you put this on, and trust me, it's no simple process, then it takes a while to clean it off and get it to really look shiny so you can actually see your reflection in it. I mean, I I don't like to cut the polishing short because this is the final process of what you see. Now this rag was clean when I started. You can see the black oxidized on it. I obviously polished the doors separately, and this one here, like I said, it needs a final touch-up polish where I check to make sure there's no spots that I missed, and then I make sure there's no handprints, and of course wearing gloves helps eliminate that. So let me set this aside and show you this one. As I told you, this is tin plate, and I put brass features on it to include the protective grid, and I actually used steel wool all over it, and I did that so that I would kind of scratch up the surface or scarify the surface so that it would hold the paint better. But obviously doing it this way is much easier than polishing it out. I did polish the grid out, and as you can see, it looks nice and bright. Now I'll do the same thing on the turn tin, which is actually tin plate on stainless steel, and it really brings out a nice finish on this. And as you can see, there's still quite a bit of oxidation, especially when on the first pass, which is the first pass that I've done in this one. The zinc is the same way. And I tried using, or I did use steel wool on this a little bit, and I found that it's really better off just to use Simichrome. Now, in some cases, during the early process of polishing, I'll use an old shirt that is actually one of these dry wicking shirts, so it's got a lot of rayon in it, and it turns, and it's okay. It's not as good as 100% cotton, and most of my cotton, as you can see, are old t-shirts. And I just did a little polishing on this on the front. You can see how shiny that's getting and how good it looks. Now, one of the issues of polishing is always the little clips that I put on, and I put on extra clips so that when they break off during the assembly process, which they do, about 20% of them will actually come off because you get bent back and forth too many times, and also because when I actually solder them in place, I try not to put too much heat on so I don't distort the metal, because it's really a pain to polish around these. So that pretty much covers the polishing process. Like I said, it's pretty straightforward. Okay, we're ready to go on spraying the Dutch Steamboat lantern. This is the one with the grids. The first thing I'll do is just take and use this dust blower. Not that there's a lot of dust on these, but it's always a good thing to do. I use Hellman Spire urethane clear gloss. I've tried other products. This takes a long time to dry, so it has a nice wetting pattern. Some of that stuff just dries so quickly that you end up with this sandpaper looking finish. When you spray paint, you got to keep in mind that you only have so many opportunities to cover the product. My theory has been if I go over it the fourth time, chances are I'll have a run. If you get a run, you almost, and it's a noticeable run in a bad place, you really have to strip the lantern with lacquer thinner, repolish it, which is a pretty big chore. If you underspray, you get this dusty looking thing. Now some people say, well, why don't you just sand it out? Well, when you sand it out, it doesn't take long before you get into the base metal and it looks pretty stupid. So I have developed a process that I always use, and I start by spraying the inside reflector, which I have to do in kind of light bursts because and then the next step is to spray the inside of the lantern top. Now, if you don't have these wire grids on it, it's pretty easy. But the wire grids look nice, but they make it a little bit complicated. Now I'll spray the bottom, or actually the inside of the back. This is not like mission critical because due to the limited access in tight places, it is difficult to spray the inside of the lantern as well as the inside of the deflector and the outside of the deflector. I use multiple bursts holding the can 12 inches or more away from where I'm spraying. I go over it numerous times to ensure that I get the proper wetting pattern. You can tell when the proper wetting pattern is achieved because the urethane spar varnish will have this milky look to it, which will flatten out and eventually go away during the drying process. If you underspray, you end up with a dusty finish, and if you overspray, of course, you end up with the dreaded drips that can result in redo. All right, that's pretty much it. I'll take it and put it inside the house and let it dry so I don't get any bugs or anything. This completes episode 9 of the Dutch Steamboat Lantern build out. The next episode is episode 10, which involves the electrification, the installation of the glass in the mirrors, and this will finally show the completed product being done, which will consist of 5 lanterns. So I'm looking forward to seeing you then. Bye.